And my special guest this week is Kelly Avalone, attorney here in San Diego. We've heard her before. She's one of my favorites here. And this week, we are going to discuss covert narcissism in family law. So, Kelly, you kind of pulled the subject up, and I'm going to let you open here because we've got a wide range of stuff to talk about. The covert narcissism piece is a particular, and let's see how this rolls.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so I've really seen a big trend in my own cases recently. But this has kind of been the verbiage that's out there, I think, for people that everybody wants to call their former spouse or call their situation or call their, co-parent a narcissist or a covert narcissist. And I think oftentimes because there is so much media on it, there's so much coverage on that right now. I think that it's often overused.
Mhm.
I don't necessarily know that every time somebody presents facts to me that I would agree. I also would say that probably 95% of the time that terminology is used, it's used as a parent or a co-parent or a former spouse, kind of saying this is what it is, as if it's based in fact, as
Mhm.
if there had been a formal diagnosis, and that isn't really the case, right? As I get into it, I often find that that's the person's opinion of what's happened, but they're in no way, shape, or form qualified to kind of make that assessment. I want to talk specifically about the covert piece because I think the covert piece is actually what makes it a lot more slippery and a lot harder to grasp. And oftentimes, I find that people are late to the party in the understanding when the covert piece is actually present. And so let's kind of talk about that. Generally speaking, I am not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, I have zero social science skill that can make diagnoses or speak to you about whether or not a diagnosis is a legitimate one. Nor am I in any way, shape, or form going to ever say to a client, I think your former spouse or co-parent is a insert label. I might say they demonstrate these types of traits. I might say
Mhm.
these are traits that you'd find if you read about X, Y, and Z. But I'm not here to make a diagnosis. I'm just here to really say, this is the information we have. These are the facts that have presented, and how we approach certain things is really going to be framed by the information that we have. And
This
so,
is a yeah. This
go
is a
ahead.
real hot spot for me, Kelly, as you're starting to lay this down because this terminology is being put forth so often, and somebody reads about it and they go, okay, that's what's happening to me. And they bring it into the conversation with their attorney or they try to put it into their pleadings or whatever. And to your point, and I think that this is really the important piece in this, is that the traits that are expressing are one, somebody's perspective because they're seeing it through a certain lens, and two, that I'm always curious about the relevance of it because what we're really looking at, and I think you're heading in that direction, is yeah, there's behavior there. What are we doing about it? Because the discussion of it really means nothing.
Right. It's the yeah, but piece. Okay. And, a lot of times, and this doesn't happen so much anymore, but early on in my career, a lot of people would run down the rabbit hole of, I need a psych eval or psychological exam of my co-parent because. And a
Mhm.
lot of things that we have to understand is, unless that's, first of all, family court very rarely orders them because they're just not that helpful for a family court situation
Yep.
in a broad stroke sense. If you have something that's very specialized, very targeted, or is something where the actions or diagnosis or lack of diagnosis of the other party is directly harming the best interest of the child and directly impacts the way in which the court needs to be informed to order, child custody and visitation moving forward. That's the only way that a psych eval is ever really truly helpful in a family court situation, or the trier of fact, your judge, is ever going to find that psych eval is truly helpful, is because is the information contained in the psych eval, or the findings, if you will, the conclusions, does that in some way, shape, or form impact the safety or welfare or best interest of the child? And if so, what safeguards need to be put in place in order to kind of protect the child's best interest? And so a lot of people used to really kind of advocate for this. I need a psych eval. But the issue and my pushback with clients is always, okay, but what is that going to show? Unless it's going to inform the court in some way, shape, or form how there is a possible danger, how this diagnosis means X, Y, and Z as it relates to parenting or as it relates to co-parenting, it's really not that helpful in your family court situation. So that's that's as an aside. And so when you talk about the buts, just because let's say somebody truly is going to have a narcissistic diagnosis, or they're going to have a covert narcissism diagnosis, even if that is to show up, first of all, your psych eval isn't going to give you the diagnosis. They're going to say they demonstrate these traits. They're not going to say I'm diagnosing them with X, Y, and Z. Those are two different functions. But let's say that there's truly a diagnosis from an independent third-party professional that was involved with your co-parent or your spouse prior to the dissolution of the relationship. Let's say that diagnosis exists, and you have this psych eval that then does a collateral contact and finds out from this psychotherapist or this psychiatrist that, hey, this diagnosis does exist. That doesn't in and of itself, having a diagnosis doesn't in and of itself prevent you from being a fabulous parent to your kids. It would be better if the people that have these diagnoses would become informed about the ways that, their words and their actions can really be very traumatizing and hurtful and, manipulative for their kids. But that's not always going to be the case. So as a standalone issue, let's say that you have a diagnosis for narcissism. Let's say that even your psych eval, let's say you get ordered, says they have narcissistic traits or covert narcissism traits or whatever, what have you. That in and of itself, that piece, in my words, so what? That doesn't necessarily manifest to, oh, well, then we're impacting custody and visitation and this person can't be an equal co-parent. That doesn't happen.
The piece that you're driving here, Kelly, is one that even as I see it with therapists, with the conversations between parents and therapists and their kids and how these things evolve, don't rise to a level most of the time of having a court make a change or drastically shift a parenting schedule. And what I find more often, and I think a lot of this is social media driven, is that the people that are making those statements, oh, they're a covert narcissist, or they're a narcissist in general, they're looking for some justification of how they were treated. And they want somebody to reprimand that person for doing what they're doing. And in family law and family court, I never, ever see that having an outcome or an effect on an outcome. And the thing that I think you're driving at, and that, my hot button is this, is let's start digging down into, okay, how do we protect this child in a way that we can get that parenting plan that when our parenting time is here, and we're back to the parallel parenting conversation of where we can actually have some guardrails on our time, because the courts don't set those guardrails on the other person's time. So it's a parenting conversation by and large.
Correct. And one of the things that, I think kind of goes to your point, and I think ultimately where we end up in this conversation today is, what are some of the solutions? What are some of the things that we should be asking for? That's kind of where this dialogue should be headed for. It's great to be informed. It's great to talk around the subject, which, to your point, a lot of social media influencers, people trying to grow their following, they will talk around the facts. They will validate you and make you feel like, yes, during your relationship, these things absolutely happen. But two things that I want to expand on. One, just because that was your experience with your co-parent doesn't, when you were married, and their treatment of you, doesn't mean that they haven't evolved and changed and that they're going to treat your kid just the same way. So to the extent that you can wipe the slate clean and say, okay, my traumas and my treatment and what I experienced is a separate aside. This is about what our child is experiencing and what impact, these behaviors and these actions have on our child. And can I identify separately times that this co-parent is doing things, whether they're similar or dissimilar, from the trauma and the things that you experienced, whether they're doing things that fall into these categories of a narcissism or a covert narcissism or what have you. And I think that's an important distinction, because everybody has biases. And when you go into your relationship with your child and then you try to take the 30,000-foot level of, let me look at my child's relationship. First of all, you're looking at the child's relationship from your perspective, not anybody else's. And so let me look at my child's relationship with this other parent. And what do I think about that? I think you have to be very cautious of your own history and your own biases and your own experience with that person. It's not to say that your history and your experience is not valid. It may very, 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 very well be valid. But you have to try to the best that you can to treat every circumstance as a standalone, whether it's to that person, whether it's to that child, whether it's your experience. You have to treat those as separate, standalone kind of columns, if you will. And so, in that, I also want to piggyback on the situation that, be very careful where you get your information from and what you are kind of gathering to say, well, this is, 100% my situation. Because a lot of people put out some buzzwords out there, and what they're doing is they're trying to get you to identify with them, and they're trying to get you to feel validated, because once you feel validated, then you think that they're the most amazing, enlightening person on the planet. And it's not to say that that's wrong, but you have to just be very, very careful where you're informed from and what you do with that information. So kind of diving a little bit into it. When there are a ton of distinctions between covert narcissism and narcissism, but I am going to generalize in this because I recognize that we only have an hour and we could talk about this for the eons of time. But in a general perspective, when I am using the word covert narcissist, I am referring to a parent who is doing, is having the hypersensitivity to criticism, or the inflated self-importance, or the attention seeking, or, those types of, self-importance, entitlement, but in a very manipulative way. And that, for me, the manipulation piece, and the very sneaky and controlling, deceptive piece, that for me is the distinction between whether you're dealing with somebody who, in a family law situation, who is, has narcissistic traits versus having covert narcissistic traits.
Okay. So in that moment, Kelly, I want to draw the distinction as to who is being affected by it and what is being done in that process. Because if we're talking about parent to parent, I think it's important for a person to understand what gaslighting means, what that covert piece of manipulation means, so they can be aware of that, be aware of the reaction that's taking place internally for them that has a level of cognitive dissonance in it, that doesn't makes sense to them, that they're feeling like they're being pushed into that place of, oh, it is my fault kind of a thing, and being able to just sit down and go, okay, this is that. But the other side of it, and I think that's for the parent to, that's for the other person, the adult, to deal with and learn how to deal with, because this is how they're going to work within the court system and work with their attorney and work with the therapist and all of that other stuff. And working with the attorney and working with the therapist are two very different pieces. And this is also where the coaching piece comes in.
Yep.
On the other effect of that, and I think that this is part of where we need to drive this conversation, is the parent understanding that the child is being subjected to this, that the child is being gaslit, that the child is being manipulated to say, do, and express in a certain way, and how they deal with that, because this is where it gets tricky to me.
Yep.
Because the parent who is not that, not in that behavioral pattern of narcissism, if you will, that is trying to protect this child and create a healthy stance for them, needs to understand that that healthy stance comes from their parenting time and how they teach that child to think critically. Does that make sense to you? Is that your experience? And not lead them, but ask the question so that child starts to lean into that place of, this isn't congruent. No, this looks this way, this looks this way. And so they do, and they learn their own sense making.
Here's my favorite question to a child. Why would they say that to you? Why would they do that?
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because when you start to ask the why, and Brooke, here's where it gets super tricky, is that in every family court order, what does it say?
Don't talk to the kids about it.
To expose the children to any type of conflict or litigation. And so when you have a parent who has done all these, who's not obeying that court order by any means, shape, or form, and that's probably a vast majority of high conflict cases out there, there is at least one parent who is not playing by the rules, and there may be two. Now, what you have is you have no awareness of what's going on, especially in a high conflict co-parenting situation where you're not co-parenting, you're parallel parenting. So really a high conflict parallel parenting situation where the family court has told you, we have an expectation that you're co-parenting. If that's not in and of itself enough confusing and impossible. But the reality becomes your high conflict and your parallel parenting. You have no idea what's going on in that other parent's house. You don't know what's being said. You don't know let's put some context to the term gaslighting. When we are talking about gaslighting, or you and I are using those words, the basic definition, when I am using that phrase, is that your actions, or I should say the actor's actions or statements or comments are causing the other person, or are meant and intended to cause the other person to question their own reality. So here's an example. Let's say that the child is, you are trying to pick the child up on a time frame that you know that the child is not supposed to be with you, but you're trying to convince the child, oh, it's fine, no big deal, yada, yada, yada. And the other child has this, this resistance, this anxiety of like, no, but this isn't the way it's supposed to go. I'm supposed to be at mom's house today, or I'm supposed to be at dad's house today. And you are saying to the child then, well, but didn't your other parent do this? Or wouldn't they just want you to do X, Y, and Z? Whatever you are doing, when you are manipulating them to say, or I'm your mom, if I tell you to do this, this is what we're doing. That is a gaslighting. That is the effect of causing them to question, well, wait, these are the rules and the boundaries and the things that I knew before, but well, what you're saying to me on its face is true. My dad did pick me up last week, so I guess this makes sense, even though maybe that's not the court order. Or you are my mom and I should listen to what you're doing. Or you're right, my dad wouldn't want me to walk home in the rain, so you should be able to pick me up and take me to get food and then take me to go home and watch a movie with you. And then I guess no harm, no foul. And you're right, that does make sense. That is a form of covert narcissism, where you are using gaslighting to control the child, and you're also you're using very manipulative statements and words and actions to try to get the child to do something that you want them to do.
So I want to rewind here for a couple of things that are germane to exactly what you're talking about. So you use the term, why would they do that? I would correct that just a little bit, because that's a little too pointed, and go to, so what is your experience of that? So it engages this back and forth of curiosity rather than it being a pointed piece, because that's the place where you can get in trouble of trying to lead that child down the road. Number two is the notion of co-parenting. And I like to insert this here, because parallel parenting is co-parenting. It's a subset that just delineates. I'm not going to get drawn into the argumentative BS of what's over there. We're about health, education, and welfare of the child, and that's the focus, and that's what we talk about.
And go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think, just kind of hunkering back on this question. Well, I do believe that, asking a broad question of what is your experience with that, depending on the IQ of the kid, depending on what the age of the kid is, I don't know that you're going to be able to be as vague as that. I like the why would they say that, because you're not pointing out that you're not pretending that an action has happened or trying to infer that an action has happened. This statement is made. The way that this comes out is a child says to you, well, dad said you're not going to pay for swim lessons. That statement's already made. The child has already identified the actor. The child has already identified that statement was made to them. And then I think it is a safe territory, albeit it is a slippery slope depending on where that conversation goes. And you may have to start, your next follow-up questions may have to be, well, what do you think about that? Well, what is your experience with that?
Right.
But I think you do, if the child already identifies that the action happened, the statement happened, and who the actor was, I think you can absolutely follow up and say, well, why would they say that to you? Or what do you think about that? But I think beyond that, you may have to get a little bit more broad, and you may have to say open-ended things, because as the child starts processing and analyzing, well, maybe they said that because they want, maybe the child gets to a point where they said that because they want me to think you're not going to pay for it. Maybe they don't. But when you get into the inferences, that's when you can't necessarily go with the pointed questions of, well, why would they feel that way? Because you're then creating inferences and not letting them just share their experience.
So where's the spot here, Kelly? Because this is a troublesome space, and this is where a lot of parents really get in confusion. And my thought always goes to, what is it that I'm going to say that's going to insert that child into the conflict, that's going to insert that child into that conversation? And what I always want to try to do is to pull them out of it, just leave them out of that as much as I can. So if it's a money conversation or something like that, I think it's best to head in the direction of, that conversation is about your mom or your dad and me, and that's got nothing to do with you. And then just drop it and leave it and move on.
And I agree, but I think you have to here's the problem. if you do what the family court lawyers and judges want you to do, it's shut the conversation down immediately and refuse to engage in it. Your mom says that, or, my mom says that you won't pay for swim lessons. Well, I'm sorry, that's not true. Your mom and I will work it out. That's not a conversation for you. It's a
Right.
very shut it down. But the problem is, Brooke, that when you have a covert narcissist, you don't necessarily know for years that basically the dialogue in that other parent's house hasn't always will be all these little manipulative things that along the way, maybe in a viewpoint of how much has been said in 3 weeks doesn't matter, but when you look at 6 years or 8 years or 10 years of things that have been said to the child in that other parent's house, it completely upends the underpinnings of the relationship between the child and the other parent. And it's not going to be until the child is much older in life and the way that their covert narcissist parent has presented is also the way now that that parent presents in their other interpersonal relationships. Because by the way, this is not necessarily about you as the
Right.
co-parent or the, parallel parent. This is
Right.
this is that person's way of moving through life, which means that they're always going to employ the same tactics and the same things, whether it's, child to father, child to grandparent, child to child's future spouse. Those relationships are always going to be manipulated and controlled in the same way by the parent who has these covert narcissistic traits. And so the child is eventually going to identify, although they might not have the vernacular for it, they might not have the words to say, oh gosh, when my mom was saying this to me, she was a covert narcissist, and really it was about her need for control, and it wasn't really about my dad or my dad's household. And that's what my mom's actually doing to me now that I'm married and have my own family and whatever else. And really it's tragic for the parent who's embedded in those actions, because they're not going to ever be able to get out of that pattern of relationship.
Right.
But as the co-parent in the moment, once you identify that this has happened, we can't just shut down the conversation and say, this doesn't involve you, we can't talk about it, because the children are very curious and they're going to go to the source of information that is free flowing, and they're going to be then getting all the misinformation. So go ahead.
What I'm driving at, Kelly, here is not shutting down the conversation, but opening it in a different direction.
And I agree with that. But I think we have to be very careful not to pivot and change the subject. I think we have to be very careful to validate or to discuss what the kids have heard and say, well, talk to me about that. Why do you think that person would have said that? Then that child gives whatever reason, and you say, well, what do you think about that? Or, well, what's your experience? Do you think that's true or false? Or, what, do you have any questions? And when you open up the do you have any questions, your kids may be asking you questions that you really can't answer, because we are getting too much into the I'm involving you, I'm whatever else. But it at least gives them the space where they feel like if they wanted to, they could ask the question.
Okay.
You might not give them the answer, but at least they know that there's a space where they can ask the question without getting lambasted or whatever. Because that's the other part about a covert narcissist or a narcissist, is that as soon as you start to challenge them and that child were to ask them follow-up questions, well, you say that dad won't pay for swim lessons. What about when dad paid for X, Y, and Z? What about when dad paid for, lacrosse? What about when dad paid for, basketball? Once that child starts to challenge that covert narcissist, you're going to see that narcissist go about face, pivot, and go that way. And
but this is the separation that happens here, Kelly, and I think I'm going to drive this back to a parenting style conversation, because if your parenting style is one of inquiry and information and dialogue, this is going to be what happens. And they're going to come to you, and you're going to be able to open that conversation to a point and go down those roads. And to your point, on the other side of that conversation, they are going to be met with something entirely different from the covert narcissist. They're going to be met with anger, shut down, don't defy me, I'm the parent, all that other stuff. And what begins to happen over time, and we see that the child will adapt to the behavior of that covert narcissist, so they don't get lambasted, so they don't get criticized, so they don't get judged, and they begin to shut down, and they begin to see that my health is over here, and I can have this conversation. So a lot of what we do long term is an evolution of that relationship, that we can't, to your very point, control what's happening in that other house, but we can be very spot on how we are parenting in relationship with that child in ours. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road in terms of the long-term health of that child and the long-term adaptation of that child in relationship going forward.
I agree. And I think, you know, I think it's a hard thing, but to some extent we have to allow the children to have their own experience and get kind of bitten by the baby rattlesnake that's deflecting and anger and everything
Absolutely
else. But it's a very hard thing as a parent to know that you know, you have a child on the other side, that when they are equipped with the tools to question, well, okay, you said that dad won't pay for this. What about when dad paid for, you know, whatever, basketball? You know, it's hard because in some respects, you know, that child is going to be met with vitriol. But the absence of doing that creates a scene where over the course of 10 years, the child has only had one narrative. And they've had a free flowing narrative from the parent who is, you know, the narcissistic or the covert narcissist parent. They have a free flowing narrative that's completely uncontroverted. And so it becomes a really difficult space to manage. And oftentimes, I would even say that it's very possible that you don't even know that that's occurring in the background, because you're so focused on parenting at your house, parallel parenting. I'm going to give you the best experience when you're in my house, and I'm going to relate to the fact that I understand that when you're not in my house, this is out of my control, and I'm going to do the best that I can do here. You're so focused on that, much to the contrary of what you've probably been accused of being the person who, you know, lots of projection here, the person who violates the court order, involves the kids, you know, constantly talks about the litigation, whatever. You've been the parent that stays in your lane, focuses on what's happening, focuses on the kids' day-to-day needs and their perceptions. You're not interrogating the kids. You're not saying, well, hey, at your mom's house, did your mom say this to you? At your dad's house, did your dad take you to therapy without my knowledge? You know, you're not saying those things to the kids. And so you're not necessarily aware that all these statements have been made. And the kids may never bring it up to you. Dad, you know, mom says dad won't pay for swim lessons. The child, depending on where the child is and how much the child wants to do that activity, the child may never bring that up again. And so you may never actually know that in their mind at mom's house, they have a perception that, well, hey, you'll pay for yourself and your, you know, new spouse to go to the Bahamas, and you'll pay for your spouse to go to, you know, North Shore, but you're not going to pay for me to do this activity that I really like. And so you don't know that that's an uncontroverted perspective that your child has, because your child's not communicating that to you.
Okay. So how do you counter that, Kelly? What's your thought?
I think you have the constant dialogues, and I think you have to be I don't think that you ever ask questions about the minute that you start getting into this routine or this dialogue of, well, what did your other parent tell you. If it's offered up and you can follow up on it, well, why do you think they would say that? That's fine. It is a completely different thing to say, well, what did your other parent tell you? Well, what's happening at that house? Well, what's happening at your dad's house? That's an interrogation piece that we should really never get into. And that's just a total like, no, once you get into that, nothing good happens there. First of all, the kid wants to protect that other parent. And so immediately when you take this tone or this positional body of, well, what's happening there? The kid feels like, oh gosh, did something bad happen that I have to protect this other parent? And so now they go into shutdown mode. So that's not going to be helpful. But I think as you're listening to the kids kind of talk about their perspectives of things, or, I will share another, case related semi anecdote of, it was unbeknownst to a client that a child was put in therapy. And this happens a lot. And when it was discovered that the child was put in therapy, the child then, in the dialogue and, in that case, one parent was not, they're not overly thrilled that they've been left out of the loop, but they also don't care that the kid's in therapy. Great, cool, awesome. But in the dialogue of, do you enjoy that? How is that going? Or do you like it? Do you feel a connection with your counselor? It came out that, oh, well, I feel a connection with my counselor, but we don't talk for the full hour. Well, what does that mean? Well, we don't talk for the full hour because my other parent sits in there. And when I forget to say something, my other parent then adds it in. And so then you say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, then it comes out that the parent is sitting in there, and every time there's a lull in the conversation, the other parent is offering up prompts. Well, if you don't know what else to talk about right now, let's talk about how it makes you feel when your other parent says this to you. And the piece of that is that never happened. The other parent never said X, Y, and Z. But now the child is almost into a hypothetical because they have a trusted adult next to them. And so the child goes into this mode of, oh, well, gosh, that actually wouldn't make me feel very good. And actually that would create a lot of problems. But the child, depending on the age and, the intelligence and what the child's experiences in life are, they start to blur that as reality. Oh, well, my trusted parent has told me the other parent has said X, Y, and Z to me.
Right. So in this type of an instance, we've run across a therapist that has blurred their lines, that they're not the child's therapist anymore because they brought the parent into the conversation, which should never happen because it's not family therapy. And that's the place where, as you discover that, you shut it down. But there are ethical problems. There are therapists out there that really don't hold to their ethical codes, and they start to do stuff because somebody's paying them. And to get that information is important information to get, right? So the first conversation that happens with that is the child's in therapy, who's the child, who's the therapist, and what's the point? I want to talk to them. And if that's not happening, we pull the plug, right?
Yeah. And, there are other ways that you pull the plug too. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you act impulsive and you say, absolutely not. But there is, what everybody has to kind of understand out there is there's a huge opportunity for family court judicial officers where they don't necessarily understand the intricacies of this dynamic. And so what happens is, if you're the parent who says, I pull the plug, it looks like you're running or hiding from something. And so you can't be impulsive and say, I pull the plug. You have to say, step one, I want to have a conversation with a therapist. Step two, we need to have an understanding about, is this now, it could be, again, I'm not a therapist. I'm not licensed as one. I wouldn't survive as one. But, I think there's room where clinical treatment can evolve from, I'm your individual counselor, to, hey, do you think we've done a lot of work together? Do you think that it would be helpful if we brought in mom or dad or siblings or grandma, grandpa, or whoever, to help you kind of work through some of these things that you've described to me, and how we can talk about that? That to me becomes, you know, a conversation where it's possible that individual therapy has moved into family therapy.
Mhm. But
But
that's by agreement.
we need to, exactly, that's by consent. That's also by a mutual understanding of all parties involved, including the patient, aka the
Mhm.
child. Like, that's by everybody involved. And that's not a sneaky covert conversation. That's not a, oh, let's just come on in. That's a very specific, very defined, very pointed, and very forward, honest conversation of the therapist saying, hey, I have made a lot of progress with little Johnny here. In the sessions, I've identified some third parties that I think that it would be beneficial to bring in at certain times with little Johnny and have that dialogue. This looks like X, Y, and Z. That's where it's on the therapist to inform the parents, to
Mhm.
say, this is what we're doing, and then everybody to have an understanding that we've now gone from individual counseling to family counseling, or potentially some Venn diagram mix of that. And
Mhm.
what does that look like? So back to the conversation of where there's an opportunity for family law judges, you have to be very patient with your family law judges who may not get it. They
Yeah.
don't necessarily understand what's happening. And so for them, they understand that, oh, yeah, dad's trying to rip the kids out of therapy. Dad's hiding something.
Yeah.
And so you have to be very patient in your education. But step one, have the conversation with the therapist. If the therapist won't meet with you, that's a huge red flag. That's a contact your attorney and file a motion. Step
Right.
two, or if the other parent is blocking you, playing games with the consent. Oh, you have to have my consent to talk to the therapist. Oh, I sent it. Oh, you didn't receive it. Maybe the pigeon is carrying it. Maybe you should
Yeah.
walk into the therapy office, right? So that becomes, those are your immediate red flags of, nope, we're doing something today, we're done. Go ahead.
And there's one more piece here that really speaks to the covert narcissistic component of this. Is when this is kind of a thing is taking place, part of the covert narcissistic playbook is triangulation. Getting that third person that is unaware of the other stuff that's going on to team up over here. And that's done through,
Yep.
there's been so much abuse, and they get that therapist to side in that arena right off of the bat, and the
Yep.
triangulation happens. And that's part of the manipulation that happens in this process. So trusting that therapist that's allowed that to happen, you got to be paying attention to that one.
Yep. And it's not just therapists, it's your pediatricians,
Yep.
it's your primary care doctors,
Yep.
it's your minors counsel. I'd like to say that in San Diego, we actually have a pretty decent band of minors counsel, but not everybody is checked in all the time. And not everybody is paying attention on the level in which they should be paying attention to every case. They're treating the patient. They're not realizing that there's this whole situation happening over here.
Right.
And so some of it, you can't fault them. They're professionals doing their job that aren't necessarily thinking about these things, because what they're thinking about is their patient. So you have to really make sure that you're not directing anger or resentment or some sort of, misinterpreted, blame towards the therapist, because maybe that's happened. But it's a very good chance that the therapist is just doing their job and they're doing the best with the facts that they presented. If
Right.
you go in and only say what you've said, that's all the therapist knows.
Right.
And so,
Right.
you have to be willing to have those conversations, willing to talk to the kids about what their experiences are. In this particular case, it actually didn't ever even come up until 6 to 8 months after treatment with this therapist had already started. And then it was identified because the child in that case said, oh, well, I can't. There was a switch in schedule where now the other parent had the child on that day. And the child said, oh, well, I can't do X, Y, and Z with you today. I have therapy. And the way that it was said was very defensive and very like, duh. And the exploration of that conversation was then, oh, well, when did you start therapy? And who goes to therapy? And it became evident in that conversation that the child was under the assumption that both parents knew, consented, brought them there, but only the one parent cared enough to sit in the therapy and listen to their concerns and help them with their emotional state. And so the subtext of all of this and the takeaway of all of this, when it's all distilled, is one parent enrolled the child in therapy, told that child, your other parent's totally on board. Your other parent is fully aware of when these appointments are happening. Your other parent is making a choice not to be here and support you. And those are the things that have been communicated to the child directly. And that was very clear when the conversation was all distilled out. And that's not even to scratch the surface on the things that the therapist had heard the parent who was sitting in the therapy sessions give as prompts to the child to again identify. I mean, it would be things like, well, how do you feel when your other parent makes you do X, Y, and Z? How do you feel when your other parent puts you in the middle? And it's repeated so often that it becomes ingrained, and it's also the child's narrative that they start to believe, which is super slippery.
Yep. Great conversation, Kelly. This is really kind of getting down into the nuance of how the conversations go, what's important to do, and how it evolves. And I think for our listeners, there's 2 points to this that I want to bring forward. Don't jump into your own fixing that piece. Don't jump into your own anger in that piece. Get some direction from your good attorney. Get some direction from your good coach. Get some direction as to how to identify this conversation that we're having of, how do you engage in that conversation with that child, and how do you not engage with that conversation with the child, and what is the nuance when you do or don't? Because to your point with the anecdote that you just gave us, there was information that nobody had. And when the information comes out, then what do you do with that information? Do you blow up, or do you come at this from a different angle? And the next iteration of that, I think, is important for our listeners, is how do you undo it, or can you even undo it? But the undoing of that type of a situation comes out of, again, how you engage in the conversation with the child and how you open that up to, oh, that isn't the reality, and dealing with the cognitive dissonance that comes out of that reality that they've been instilled in.
Absolutely. And I think that, you kind of hit it on the head when you said, how do you deal with it? Do you blow up? No, that's never the right option. Remember that when you have a high conflict co-parent, or high conflict parent on the other side, I should say, and you have a situation that is, too hot to touch right now, gray rock, indifference, distance yourself,
disengage.
We're done. There's so much good material on, just disengaging, but you can't also make that be your default with your kids. You
No,
can't ever disengage with your kids.
no.
You always, always, always gray rock and disengage with your co-parent, but you don't ever employ the same tactics on your children. And the other thing that you have to understand, I mean, there may be situations, I say ever, never, those are absolutes. There's always room for variables, right? If you have a child with, oppositional defiance disorder or significant ADHD issues, maybe you do disengage. I don't know. That's a separate as an aside. But here with your children, their experience is going to be so flooded by the other. It's almost like the other parent has uncontrollable word vomit, and they're just going to tell the child everything under the sun that they possibly can. And they're going to think that it has the most impact in degrading your relationship and your connection with them, because it goes back to that control piece and it goes back to that manipulation. And so the best thing that you can do is disengage with your co-parent, because your co-parent then gets frustrated and tells your children that you're disengaged, you don't respond, you won't communicate, you whatever else. And that has to be vastly different from the experience that your children get from you.
Right.
That's the best thing you can do, is figure out ways that you can make the things that are coming out of your co-parent's mouth be an absolute vast difference from the things that your children experience with you.
Yeah. So we have blown up the better part of this hour. What I want to do is, we are live streamed. We do have some people that are listening here. If somebody would like to come in and ask some questions of Kelly or myself here, I want to open that up. And while that is getting opened, I also want to really thank you, Kelly, for coming in and doing this. This is valuable time of yours. This is valuable time for our listeners, and for our listeners to come in and engage in this conversation, because this conversation is the nuance that doesn't get talked about enough. This is the conversations of, yeah, there's this, and there's a general way to approach this, and it isn't the answer to everything. We've got to start to dig in, and you guys cannot do this on your own. It's not something that you are trained to do. It's not something that you are capable of doing, and having the right professionals in your corner are important.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. So we will sit here for a minute, and I have let Mossy open the conversation up and see if anybody's got some questions here. This is the first time we've done this, so we're experimenting a
From
little
the
bit.
first?
You're the
I love
first.
that.
Okay. I'm not seeing anything happening here. And we might not get engagement today.
That's okay.
Ah.
We'll still be here for this topic, because this is not going away anytime soon.
Oh, here it is. So Mossy just informed me that this is YouTube, and it's delayed slightly, so we need to wait on them just a bit.
Okay.
See, we're still getting new information. So Kelly, kind of while we're waiting for people to engage in the conversation, if in fact we do, I'm going to say to Masi, the producer in here, to edit all of this stuff for sure. But um, I think the place where so many people get frustrated here is that there is no clear path, and that there is a level of having to give up agency, to abdicate to somebody who doesn't understand the situation, or at least you don't believe understands the situation the way that you do. And that's an absolute fact. They don't have the resources, the perspective to do so, and they are making decisions based on what they see. And what you give to those people that are watching is of the utmost importance. What your dialogue is, what your narrative is, what your attitude is, what your approach is so important.
Brooke,
So,
I think even more so than that, it's not even just that there's no clear path, there's conflicting information and there's conflicting rules. Because even just you and I in this conversation both see, the conversation starting with a child in a different way. You want to
mhm,
say what is your experience? I want to say if the statement has already been identified, the actor's already been identified, the action, the statement has been said, I want to ask the child, why would they say that to you?
yeah,
Because I want them to critically think about those actions and the words that they're hearing and what I tell people all the time, you don't get to control the subtext of your words, right? You
yeah.
don't get to control what somebody else takes away. And so it's really hard because in family court, our golden rule is do not involve the children.
Right. So we just got a comment from the YouTube group. Um, they said this is very informative and thank you. A mental health evaluation has been ordered 7 months ago, still has not been done. High conflict does not take two people always, and it doesn't. It can, but I want to nuance that conversation a little bit. It does take two people because there are two people involved in it. What each person does in that conflict predicates the outcomes of that. So if you've got somebody that's really driving the conflict and you're on this other side of that conversation and you're staying disengaged from it, you're really focused on how you approach each conversation and how you stay child centric in that process is indicative of how your child is going to come out the other end of that.
Mhm.
But it's also going to be indicative of how the system perceives the conflict. So there, in conflict, there are two people. Even in Aikido, there are two people, but the person that is practicing Aikido in it has the skill set of disengagement and letting the flow of the conflict go by them. So I just wanted to
So I think,
bring that into a little more focus.
and I think what you're trying, I'll go on a limb and say, I agree with the comment that high conflict does not take two people. Well, I disagree with that comment, but what you're really trying to say is it's not necessarily the fault of two people. And I would agree with that latter comment. A high conflict situation is not necessarily the fault of two people,
Right.
but it's what choice you make. We are only responsible for our actions. So, what is the choice that you're making at the point in which your case is high conflict? If the choice that you're making is gray rock, disengage, indifference, then you're right. It doesn't take two people, because this other person is going to continue to be high conflict. Just to your point, the person who is in practice is not necessarily going to be engaging and fueling that conflict. Let me tell you what, from a family court perspective, if I see a running list of talking parents messages, our family wizard, app flows, whatever else is out there, of all one-sided communication, I'm not going to necessarily look at that other parent and say, wow, you're disengaged, you don't care. I'm first going to say, why does this person communicate so much?
Mhm.
And so it does not take two people. It does take two people, because there has to be somebody for the other person to fight with, right? But
Right.
it's not necessarily the fault of two people.
Correct.
But you are making choices every day as to whether or not it's your fault. Because if you choose to engage, and man, it's hard not to. Oh, it's so hard not to. But if you choose not to engage, you're making a choice that you're not going to be at fault for the conflict that day. But every day we're making choices, and we're going to have slip ups. And some days you're like, you know what? This response is really worth it. I was on a 100-day streak, but this response is worth it. We get it. But in some degrees, it does take two people, because there has to be somebody for the other person to be fighting with. Notice that when you actually truly disengage, the level of communication starts to dwindle, because the other person gets bored. What do we tell our kids when a bully or their sibling is, being irritating? Ignore them. Don't give them a reaction.
There's
right?
so much that comes out of our childhood that we didn't incorporate, right?
I know. And I'm not sure what to say about the psych eval was ordered 7 months ago and still hasn't been done. If the custody is where you want the custody to be, or this person has very limited custody, it may be to your advantage that they're not doing it done, or they're not getting it done, because
Mhm.
it sounds to me like the family court has made that a condition precedent of coming back and modifying. And so it may be to your advantage not to push on that. It may also be to your advantage to say, no, if they're exercising visitation currently and you believe that that visitation is detrimental, and the psych eval is going to show how they have little things that is impacting health, welfare, best interest of the child, truly have that conversation with your attorney with realistic expectations. Then it may be beneficial for you to say, no, we need to give some pushback. Why hasn't this been done yet? But if you're in the catbird seat, you don't need to make the first motion. Sit still. It's up to them not to advocate for that.
So there's one more comment here from the YouTube group. The title of narcissism does not matter. The words and actions that affect the child does.
Bingo. So this is back to the part, Brooke, where and I'm just going to jump in. I know, I'm sorry, but this is a part in the very beginning, and I didn't ever follow back on because I got lost in the substance of everything else, but you said it directly. It ends up in our pleadings. Stop. It's off-putting. Your family court judges don't want to hear that your ex is a narcissist. They want to hear your ex enrolled them in therapy, didn't tell you they were in therapy, told the child that you didn't care enough to attend the therapy, told the therapist you were abusive and didn't care enough to attend the therapy, and then attended the child's therapy and called it individual therapy. That's what they want to hear. They don't want some headliner that my ex is a narcissist. Stop with those words, because the title really doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I think from my standpoint as a coach, and I think you would agree as your standpoint as an attorney, that when I hear that, I'm put off.
Okay.
And what I want to hear is what you just said, is I want to hear the behavior. What is it that we are going to pull out of that conversation, that we are going to put into our narrative, that is germane to the health, education, and welfare of that child, to the best interest of that child going forward. And that behavior is the point.
Yep. And I say it all the time. Give me the facts. Don't truncate it in a label. Don't tell me, our child is suffering. What does that mean? What is that experience? Because if you really want your attorney to your point a little bit ago of it feels very scary to have this, give up some agency and let this third party who's not living your life advocate for you and speak for you. When you give that type of agency away, that is a whole different level of trust. And it's trust surrounding the most integral things that we care about. And so, I want to know the facts as if I was a fly on the wall when the situation went down. I want to understand that. I don't want to understand the label. I don't want to understand how you would summarize it. I want to know they were wearing a red shirt, screaming, whatever.
Nice. Okay, I think that wraps us up today. Kelly, again, I thank you for coming in and having the conversation. For our YouTube listeners, thank you for coming in and engaging with us here today. Again, this has been episode 310, Covert Narcissism and Family Law. Thank you again, Kelly. Everybody keep listening to us. You can come to our YouTube channel. You can come to our website. You can come to our membership site, disengage.highconflict.net. We have support groups. We have lots of stuff to help you navigate this. So again, everybody take care, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
So don't go away yet, Kelly. This has to download.
No problem.
Just takes a minute.
No problem.